Hello, everybody. Welcome to Levine Museum of the New South's Shaping Charlotte program, COVID-19 in Communities of Color, What History Tells Us. This is part 3 of a 3-part series. We have already explored what history tells us about the COVID-19 pandemic in Charlotte's African American community, as well as the Latinx community. Tonight, we will be exploring how the COVID-19 pandemic has been affecting disproportionately our Asian, Southeast Asian, Pacific Island communities. As always, we want to ground this work in history. So as we look at this, what we've been talking about is that health inequality and access has particularly affected many within our community, specifically the groups of African Americans, Latinx populations, and our Asian American populations and Pacific Islanders. But the ongoing pandemic has also brought hate crimes and harassment towards the AAPI community. Tonight, we will have guest panelists, Dr. Heidi Kim, Kat Lee, and Chavi Koneru will join us to take a deep dive into the history and inequalities and otherness towards Asian and Pacific Islanders, its manifestation during the pandemic, and how local groups are organizing to support in these trying times. With us tonight, we have, as I said, 3 panelists. Kat Lee, who uses all pronouns, who was born in London and has been organizing in North Carolina for the last 9 years after moving to Charlotte from Oakland. Kat is a director and one of 7 organizers at the SEAC Village, a grassroots social justice organization organizing around mass incarceration, police violence, racial and gender injustice, and anti-deportation. The heart of the SEAC Village is the youth family made up of Black and Southeast Asian youth from East and West Charlotte. The SEAC Village is one part of a large, powerful Charlotte movement family, which is made up with collectives such as Charlotte Uprising, Comunidad Colectiva, and more. Kat's past work has included power building and organizing with nail salon workers, farm workers, sex workers, families facing deportation, people incarcerated, and youth in San Francisco, Oakland, Charlotte, Greensboro, Vietnam, and Mexico. Kat has a BA in Ethnic Studies from UC Berkeley. Kat grew up in a multi-generational refugee household with her grandparents, aunties, co-sibs, and 4 siblings. Kat loves thrifting, the electric slide, and doing DIY projects in her RV for her baby, Thing Zan, which translates to blue sky. Kat would be lost without her partner and chosen family. Thank you, Kat, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to talking.
Absolutely. Chavi Koneru is co-founder and executive director of North Carolina Asian Americans Together, also known as NCAAT. Koneru moved to North Carolina in 1989 and has spent the majority of her life living in the state, including attending college and law school locally at the University of North Carolina. This has allowed her to gain a deep personal understanding of what it means to be AAPI in the South. Additionally, her legal background in voting rights law has given her the opportunity to interpret and enforce laws impacting the AAPI community, including during her time in the voting section of the U.S. Department of Justice, where she focused on language access for AAPI voters. Welcome, Chavi, and thank you for joining us today.
I was muted. Thanks for including me.
Understood. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Heidi Kim is an associate professor of English and comparative literature at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and the inaugural director of the UNC Asian American Center. She specializes in 20th century U.S. literary criticism and interdisciplinary Asian American studies. Her book, Illegal Immigrants, Model Minorities, The Cold War of Chinese American Narrative, will be out from Temple University Press later this year. She also is chair of the board of North Carolina Asian Americans Together. Welcome, Dr. Kim.
Thanks, Braxton. I'm delighted to be here.
Oh, well, we're very happy to hear you, to have you. And we look forward to hearing your history, which we will start off with. As always, Levine Museum of the New South, we feel compelled to be the center of some of the tough cultural discussions that are happening here and now in Charlotte and beyond. And we also believe that history is something that happens around us. It's not something that just sits dusty on a shelf. But we also know that in order to understand the histories that is happening around us, it has to be grounded in what has come before us. So for the next few minutes, we're going to turn it over to Dr. Kim, who is going to share some historical context of the current situation that the AAPI community here in Charlotte, North Carolina, and all across the country are facing, dealing with this pandemic.
Thanks. What I'm going to do is try to offer not a comprehensive history, which would be really hard to do in 10 minutes, but some interesting time points that I think are really key to understanding how the Asian American population has been shaped, both nationally and specifically in North Carolina, and also a few key time points along the way in terms of public health, which I think are really helpful in understanding the kind of racism and hate crimes that have been directed at Asian Americans and Asian residents post-COVID. So I'll start where it begins. Of course, Asian Americans, or Asians, as they would have been thought of then, have been in the U.S. since before there was a U.S. So, you know, Asian sailors, merchants, diplomats have been in this area since colonial times. And so it's in the 19th century usually that people really start paying close attention to Asian American history. And a lot of that focuses on Chinese labor in the American West. So Chinese workers who were imported to work on the Transcontinental Railroad, famously, and then found their way to the mining industry in California and gradually to commerce there. So this is where I'm going to start a few different images for you, just so we have something to look at other than my face. So this is an image from 1882. 1882 is a year that history buffs might better know as the year of the famous Chinese Exclusion Act, an act which federally codified the restrictions on immigration that had already been coming into place, and that tried to really stem the flow of Chinese immigration to the US, and was fairly successful in doing so. This is a cartoon from a paper called The Wasp. And I'm not sure how well you can all see it at home, but it shows three ghostly figures: malarium, which is malaria, smallpox, and leprosy. And leprosy in particular is grounded in Chinatown. And so very early on, we have this kind of association of disease and poverty with this population, which of course was a population imported specifically for hard labor and segregated in poor conditions. So they're self-fulfilling prophecies in a certain sense. And in 1900 to 1907, this really came to a head. This is a history that is not really widely known, but in San Francisco and the local area in this era, there were huge bubonic plague outbreaks. And that's a picture on your right of San Francisco Chinatown before the famous earthquake, which also happened during this time period. It was quite an eventful time. And so when these plagues started breaking out, there was a lot of fear. I'm sure nobody will be surprised to hear it was very quickly politicized. One of the main methods of containment that was used was a cordon around Chinatown, and that was protested by many people for economic reasons, and also because, as we know, wasn't efficacious. You know, people, and specifically one race or ethnicity of people, are not the vector of this or another disease. So Rupert Blue, who's pictured on the left, was actually the public health official who was able to contain this. He had a really intense focus on eradicating rats, which was especially necessary after the earthquake. And so finally, they were able to contain and end the bubonic plague, but not after a really severe toll had been taken. And I just want to add as a footnote that Rupert Blue later became the Surgeon General of the United States and was the Surgeon General during the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, which we have all begun to become more familiar with recently. So he had quite a storied career as a public health official. And so this kind of, I mention this because this is a historical time point that really shows the problems that intersected of segregation, public housing, public health, medical care, equitable access to medical care, communication, politics, all these things that come together in a public health crisis. Now, in the South, Chinese and other Asian labor was likewise imported during Reconstruction, specifically as a means of enforcing Jim Crow, bringing in economic competition in order to try to subjugate African American sharecroppers. North Carolina did not participate as heavily in this and actually had a very unusual kind of Asian American first, which was the very famous so-called Siamese twins, the Bunker twins, Chang and Ang, who settled in Mount Airy. They owned land, they owned slaves, they married two white women, sisters, and one of their sons attended UNC. So a very singular time point. They were even able to become US citizens, which was technically illegal and remained illegal for Asians to naturalize until after World War II.
Dr. Kim.
Yeah.
Can I ask you one favor? Could you go into presentation mode on your slides? It would just be a little easier for our audience.
I am in presentation mode. Is it not showing that way?
I believe not. If you are, that's okay. We'll deal with it.
Well, let me try to go into it again and we'll see if that does any good.
Or full screen, perhaps.
I'll just full screen it and we'll do our best since technology is not cooperating. Is that a little better?
This will work for us right now. Thank you.
Okay. So I wanted to give a little time point, a little modern time point. So in 1950, right, we're at another census moment, very critical census moment here. The North Carolina population is 4 million. It's recorded as 3 million white and about 1 million non-white, as that group was called. And of these, 98 were Japanese, 345 were Chinese. So this is when Asian Americans are slowly filtering out, moving into different occupations. Probably a lot of these people were small businesses, maybe small farmers. And just for kind of a local time point in your heads, the city of Charlotte at this point is about 133,000 in terms of population. So about twice the size of Raleigh, which might bring some joy to some locals. So I give 1950 as a time point because the reshaping of the Asian American community really takes off in the second half of the 20th century. So in 1952, a new Immigration and Nationality Act was passed. And that was meant to be a big reform, but in terms of Asian immigration, it still preserved the national quota system that very, very severely limited Asian migration. 1965 is usually remembered as the real immigration reform in terms of Asian American immigration. And so this got rid of the national quota law. It prioritized family reunification. It prioritized certain careers. So most favored, more favored occupations got priority, and that began much of the influx of Asian American healthcare workers who were born and perhaps educated abroad. And then in 1975, refugee acts were passed to allow the migration of refugees from Southeast Asia. So these are not the only, obviously, laws that were passed that affected immigration, but these are three time points that profoundly affected the composition of the Asian American community today. And so post 65, post 75, we see huge demographic shifts take place. So my parents immigrated in the 1970s, so they're post 65 products, and maybe others on this panel have their own family stories to tell as far as that's concerned. I want to point out, specifically related to the Refugee Act of 1975, that again, we have this kind of association with disease. Now, I've got a little quotation here, which unfortunately, since you're not able to see my presentation mode, you might not be able to read. But this is an article from Canada, but describing common problems in the camps where refugees from Southeast Asia were being housed, and that there was a very high prevalence of worms, bacterial infections, tuberculosis, Hep B, even leprosy is mentioned here, and in addition to that, mental health illnesses. So this is on the right is a 2008 publication that is still addressing some of these issues. And these, of course, these aren't the kinds of cartoons, the kinds of racist and fear-mongering statements and cartoons that I showed you earlier. But nonetheless, this shows from a public health standpoint that there is this kind of continued association with disease. And there's not a lot of work done on this kind of public health history regarding Asian Americans. And so this is something that I'm hoping myself to follow up and continue to explore. So just to think about where this takes us today, after lots of changes in migration, the North Carolina population will hopefully get our good 2020 numbers, but the North Carolina population, you can see, has been very steadily growing. Even from 2000 to 2015, we have a doubling of the relative percentage in North Carolina. And in terms of foreign-born Asian Americans, I thought that this was really helpful. So again, I'll just quickly mention, in case you're having difficulty reading, the highest number of foreign-born Asian Americans in North Carolina come from India. You can see there's a huge spike over the course of the first decade of the 2000s. And then running down the list, it's China, Vietnam, Philippines, South Korea, Thailand, Laos, and Japan. So that's where we are today, where we have this steadily growing, very diverse population, much of which is foreign-born. And so we have people who are entering into American society newly, coming from very different backgrounds, speaking different languages. And we also have US-born, US citizens who might speak one language, might speak two languages, might speak many languages. So we have a very diverse community, and yet in a way, the kind of negativity of COVID, the hate crimes, and the negative rhetoric have brought us all together, and certainly brought us here tonight. So I'm looking forward to talking about that more.
Thank you very much for that history, Dr. Kim. And I'd love to bring our other experts into this conversation. Kat and Chavi, you listen to the history that Dr. Kim just talked about. As Dr. Kim said, this was just a short, kind of very high level understanding of it. You both have a very deep understanding about how portions of our AAPI communities have formed here in Charlotte. How does that history inform where we are today, specifically as it relates to the communities as we're dealing with the pandemic? But of course, that can't be separated or divorced from the overall stance and situation of our AAPI communities here in Charlotte and across the state.
This is Chavi Koneru. Just yeah, I mean, so I, like Kat, moved here from Oakland, California, in 1989, and so I've seen the growth and the rise of some populations, and I think what Heidi's background has shown us is that it's had a huge impact on the economic status of certain populations when they came over, what their career choices were. And even in Charlotte, I think the way that the sort of community is laid out, you can tell like the regions that have kind of the immigrants who've been here for quite a while, and some of the newer folks. But I'll let Kat speak to the Charlotte stuff more since I'm in Raleigh.
Yeah, thank you, Chavi, and thank you, Heidi. You know, before this call, I was just mentioning to Heidi how we need so much more of Asian American studies, ethnic studies in North Carolina so that we can actually see these patterns and understand the roots of what our communities are facing today. What Heidi's presentation really I think highlighted for me was the racialization of Asian American folks in the US, which has been parallel to all people of color here and indigenous people that were here before white people were here. So I think about that a lot as a theme that in our youth program, you know, and in our base with Southeast Asian and Black, and how we're continuing always to try to take these things apart and give youth the political education and the historical analysis of how we came to be in the society and why we face the things that we do. And those things are not taught in school. Oftentimes they're something you have to access in higher education during my time. But you know, at this time, you can find a lot of good information online. I think when it comes to specifically the Southeast Asian community, and you know, I just also want to offer this as something that we think about, because you know, the Asian American Pacific Islander category is something that has been created by white supremacy. That is a grouping of people that made sense in terms of white folk needing to categorize us, put us into these categories as a way to better marginalize us. So when we talk about Asian American communities, you know, and we talk about, you know, what that looks like, oftentimes, if we're not disaggregating that group, there are groups like Southeast Asians that didn't come with visas, came with a refugee status that Heidi talked about in the 1980s, even more recently, that face different things. So I just wanted to offer that as something we think about. And the same is for Pacific Islanders. If you're just taking a lot of the data points about Asian Americans, you're not actually seeing the individual traumas and experiences and histories of different groups that become invisibilized in that category. And the same goes for like certain South Asian populations. The Bangladeshi population has a high poverty rate. So what are we doing when we just are thinking about COVID as it relates to Asian American groups? Are we breaking it down further? Are we highlighting the things that impact us across the board, like anti-Asian violence, you know? So I just wanted to offer that right now, because I think we sometimes do a disservice. And I personally have grappled with the Asian American category by being an organizer, being in San Francisco, which is a third Chinese, and being Southeast Asian and trying to do civil rights work. So I have, you know, a lot of history with trying to figure out how we can still identify with Asian Americanness, but be really real about some of the gaps within.
Well, Kat, you bring up a great point, and why don't we just stay right there? We were going to try to go into it a little later in the program, but since you brought us there, let's stay there. Oftentimes, as you said, the most vulnerable in our communities can be overlooked. We also know that Southeast Asian communities face unique challenges and disparities. How has this pandemic affected Southeast Asian communities, particularly our Southeast Asian communities in our rural areas?
Yeah. So let me tie it back to some of the things I said. You know, the framing with this question is something I also want to offer that we expand a little bit more. And the reason I say that is, you know, SEAC is part, and I have gotten a lot of my education about liberation from other communities, from different Southeast Asian groups, from families that are going through deportation, through Latinx folks, through Black trans organizers that I'm in community with. And these are the groups that I really am accountable to. So when I think about liberation and I think about what we're facing with this COVID pandemic, it's a lot broader than just this pandemic. Our communities have been living here, trying to survive as a community for a very long time with other pandemics, if you will, that we've been, you know, facing. And I think one of our families said it best when someone who is the partner of someone facing Southeast Asian deportation for a crime he committed years ago, has already gone to prison for, but because the immigration laws are as so, he being a refugee from Laos is now facing deportation back to Laos, a country he's never even really lived in. So this member in our village, their partner told me, you know, it's kind of fucked up because in the same time that we're preparing for my husband's imminent deportation, I'm also trying to prepare because of this pandemic. So I'm trying to offload a bunch of stuff, figure out where to live, figure out how not to further, you know, like invest in like a house. But at the same time, I have to figure out what my family needs and how to get rice, how to get, you know, the things. So I think that that was an example for me that I just wanted to share of like how our communities, our Southeast Asian folks, are facing a lot of different levels of crisis already. And I'd be remiss not to mention that our Black, Indigenous, trans folks, it's the same thing. What happens when you're part of a country that has not really invested or has already abandoned you in terms of surviving and thriving? What happens when an additional pandemic hits, which doesn't allow you to work, maybe doesn't allow you to take part in an already criminalized economy that you've been a part of? So, you know, I kind of want to reframe a little because I think it's more than just this pandemic. I think just to go back to disaggregating data, and I'll say this one thing, and I definitely want to hear from Heidi and Chavi too, is that if you just look at the Asian American numbers and you're thinking about the impact in communities of color, you know, you're not going to see that the distribution centers in South Charlotte that border the South Carolina border are full of Southeast Asian refugees. You're not going to see that the poultry factories, the paper factories, the furniture distribution centers, I can go on, where you get your crackers and cookies and bread, are full of Southeast Asian essential workers that have had to go back to work, have been forced, not by choice, but have been forced to go back and make money so that they can buy food and keep their families afloat. And oftentimes we're not looking at capitalism in this. So I want to put that out there because it is capitalism that forces our Southeast Asian parents to go back to work, risk their lives so that rich people and corporations feel less of the impact that then we have to absorb, less of a disruption in their lives because we have to go back and work. And I will just say that, you know, in our village, in our base, we've seen a increase in COVID cases. We've seen, we've heard from parents, we've heard from community members, we've had our own staff, as we call them, squad, who are from the community, have parents that have contracted. We've had deaths in our village. So we know that this impacts us. And oftentimes when people are contracting COVID, they don't feel that the healthcare system is going to keep them safe. They're not going to go to the hospital, that can't even understand that they're not Vietnamese, they're Montagnard, and they speak a tribal dialect, So I can just go on and on about the impacts, but part of it is, us widening our frame to see that these systems, under this pandemic, I see that we can see what is not working even more. All of those things become amplified even more.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kat, for course correcting. That's exactly why we're having these conversations, is to bring experts that people in our Levine family might not be familiar with, to help us better frame our lens moving forward as we write down and capture the history as it passes. But you brought up an excellent point. I think this is a tying bond between our part one and part two. Our greater Asian American community here in Charlotte, North Carolina, in America, shares a bond with our Latinx community and our Black community, in that these communities have been brought here to provide essential work over time, as essential services and labor that haven't always been reciprocated by wages and rights, but that has seemed to create the foundation for the disproportionate effects of the pandemic that we see today. So, Dr. Kim, Chavi, I would love to explore the idea and the connection between our populations and the need to provide these essential work and these essential services, and how does that connect to the disproportionate effects of COVID on our Asian American community?
I just want to jump in and also, add to what Kat brought up earlier as far as Asian Americans and disaggregating data. Absolutely, it's important that we're looking at each ethnicity separately and separating that data, but also, and that the term Asian American did come from this white supremacist history, but also from the perspective that our organization is coming from, it's reclaiming the term to really build power, right? Because by ourselves, none of our API ethnic groups in North Carolina are big enough to really make a difference when it comes to democracy and voting. But together, we can make a huge impact. And that's kind of where our organization is coming from. And I also saw a question here about the documentation of hate crimes. I wanted to respond to that. We have a portal on our website that we've been documenting hate crimes on, and the need for it really came because we noticed that people would share with us one-on-one some of the situations they were facing, but there was a lot of shame associated with sharing it in their communities as if they might have done something to bring that on themselves. And so making this anonymous portal both allowed them to share their story without feeling targeted in any way, and also allows us to kind of build these statistics that don't exist in North Carolina about Asian Americans. That's a lot of the work that we're doing, is also research and trying to tell the story of APIs in North Carolina.
Are these, so I'm glad you are collecting those stories and those statistics, but is there anybody that is aggregating all the organizations like yours that are collecting these stories? Are there statistics that we can find anywhere about this?
Nationally or within the state?
Either or, both ends.
So within the state, I don't know of anyone aside from us who is collecting that data. I don't know, Kat, if you know anybody else, but and then nationally, there are several groups that that are collecting data. I know Kat and I are part of a national coalition that's working together on these anti-discrimination projects. And I think ultimately there probably will be a source to go to for all this information, but at this point, there's nowhere to, I think, point to.
Dr. Kim, do you know of anything on the national scale that's collecting?
Not that's aggregating. There are several reporting mechanisms on the national level, but I don't know of any body that is sort of sitting down and going around to those and adding them up. I think the biggest one I know of is called Stop AAPI Hate. And they are getting a large volume of reports nationwide.
So let's stay there really for a quick second. It's an uncomfortable conversation for me personally to even say this term out loud. But you know, we have our president who has referred to COVID-19 over and over again as the Chinese virus and other derogatory terms. A lot of people often try brush off our president's rhetoric as just what the president does. But a lot of people in the community know that when terms like that get thrown around, they have real impacts on people's lives, particularly in the happening of hate crimes and other discriminatory practices and hateful and violent acts towards people in our communities. For folks that are out there that are wondering, is the reactions from the community at large, are these things real? Are people really becoming emboldened by the rhetoric that we're hearing about in the media, out of politicians, out of other cultural leaders? What is the effect of that rhetoric on our communities, our API communities here in Charlotte and all across the country?
Well, so I'll just say, and then I'll let Kat and Heidi jump in, that absolutely, the answer is yes. In general, you can see kind of an example of this is the rhetoric around Muslims or folks who appear to be Muslim. And this is just kind of like in line with that. So right at the very beginning of the pandemic, we noticed a lot of folks just deciding to not eat at Asian restaurants or not engage with Asian shop owners. And then we've seen that get worse and worse in public places where people feel emboldened to make a face towards somebody because they happen to look East Asian, or treat them with a lesser degree of respect. And when you have people in power that are kind of saying it's okay to act like this, you know, that's really not surprising.
Anybody else wants to chime in? Feel free, but if not, we can definitely move on. Kat, you mentioned that the Montegard community. Many people might not know that North Carolina has the largest Montegard community outside of Southeast Asia and the fourth largest Hmong community nationally. These are important numbers for those communities in our state. We also know that this is a census year, a year where everybody is counted. How and that is particularly important for minority groups to be recognized and to get services and to be seen by our laws and our practices. How is COVID-19 and other anti-immigrant and anti-Asian rhetoric impacting census responsiveness from these minority communities?
You know, we had a field plan for kind of door-to-door outreach, along with some of the other issue-based building that we do at the doors with folks, and we've had to cancel that in 4 different counties. So we've really kind of like now flipped to doing a lot of census education when we're doing our mutual aid work, which is something we started after COVID. I think that, you know, this is a unique year for some of those communities. I wouldn't say unique, it's a long time coming type of effort for some of those communities you mentioned. I was talking to my colleague today who's Montagnard and is running our census work. And she was just sharing with me about how this is the year that there's a real push for Montagnard folks to identify as either Montagnard or Dega or their specific tribal entities. There's a push for Hmong folks who are from the nation state of Laos to actually put in that they're Hmong. So there's also some challenges in that, like resources are low. We don't have information. We don't have a lot of good information that's in language. Sometimes our populations are not literate in those languages that have been created by colonial powers, oftentimes, or have been alphabetized by Western countries. So there's a lot of challenges there, but we're trying to do our best. Regarding anti-Asian violence, I just want to echo what Chavi said and totally agree that this is very, very real for us. This is very, very real for us. And no matter what, if you are Asian passing or Asian looking, no matter what ethnicity, everybody has been feeling this, including members in our squad members, our squad who have been out shopping for mutual aid for our villages and have experienced it directly. We know, I think generally, that this time, especially with this president, that it has given a license to very emboldened racism. It's not just anti-Asian. It's emboldened people when it comes to transphobia, when it comes to pretty much anything, folks that are disabled. So, and I know that for sure. Being in Charlotte, we always say that we're a progressive like city, but right around us is something else. Every county around us is something else. So we feel that. We feel the impact of that for sure.
I just want to echo what Kat said as far as thinking you live in a progressive area and having the last couple of years show you that that really isn't the case. And just this response to the census question, one interesting thing that we've seen, because we have been doing a lot of work on trying to get Asian Americans in North Carolina to complete the census and provide language support in different languages, is that foreign-born individuals within the API community have been more responsive to the census so far than folks born here. And I wonder, I think my theory is that it's because they know what's at stake. And I think it's really, really important for the rest of us to realize that if we want to support our communities, those of us born here, those of us with more privilege and more access, really need to complete the census. I'll hand it off to Heidi now.
Dr. Kim, if you want to chime in, feel free.
You know, I think that among the UNC community, you know, we've had quite a few events about Asian Americans and COVID, and the level of fear and anxiety has been profound. And the fear that people also report on the part of their family members, right? The kind of daily aggressions, not microaggressions anymore, aggressions that people are experiencing as they try to go about their business has been really staggering. And that's why it was so important, I think, when NCAT started its reporting mechanism, all the work that Kat is doing as well in Charlotte. You know, I also wonder, you know, speaking to that kind of divide that you're seeing in NCAT census work, Chavi, whether some of that is maybe kind of a cynicism, right? A kind of a feeling of that the system is broken, right? That's feeling a lot of people are sharing right now, and not really trusting that filling out the census is going to do anything to fix it. Just a theory.
Well, we can stay in that neighborhood. Dr. Kim, as a board member of NCAT and director of the UNC Asian American Center, you also have to think beyond the immediate needs that we have and our communities have. But how can short-term immediate responses of this new reality be part of long-term solutions of the work that has already been happening by the groups that you represent and all across this country?
I think that when you're working with a very diverse and historically, politically very disempowered community, the short term builds into the long term. And you have to be purposeful and strategic, as fortunately the leaders we have with us on this panel are. But I also think that, Asian America is a very new political formation, right? And as Kat says, it doesn't entirely come out of a good place. But, it's sort of a matter of like, we've ridden this horse this far. And, from the late 60s, when the term was invented, to now, it has been a notoriously weak political formation, right? Because of the diversity that it houses. And so really, in a sense, I think that all of these short-term actions, if they're really producing action, right? If they're bringing people together, if they're raising awareness, they are bricks in the wall. And so, and I think that way in my own daily work, right? Every course that I teach, right? I see as another piece of that consciousness, of that kind of consciousness raising. I'd love to hear how Kat and Chavi kind of frame that to themselves as you go about your everyday work. Because I think that especially when you work in grassroots, having that kind of consciousness, that's what sustains you, right? That sense of purpose.
Well, I actually would love Kat and Chavi to come in here, and we had a couple questions that we're going to do just that. Kat, SEAC Village has a great response to the pandemic with the Backup Rice campaign. Can you tell us a little bit about its significance and how folks that are watching can continue to support your and SEAC's efforts around that?
Yeah, so at the beginning of the pandemic, we started hearing from our youth actually on different things that their families needed because their parents weren't able to work in the factories. One of our youth talked about having a family of 11 and both parents not being able to work, and being a young mom herself, like they didn't know where their rice would come from. The idea of helping each other out and sort of being like a village, being that you take a little bit less if someone else needs more, has been something that's been a foundation of SEAC for a while. We're a nonprofit. We are in the nonprofit industrial complex. I hate that also because it creates so many limitations, and also just like it's part of a capitalist structure. So the shit we have to do sometimes is against some of the ways that I envision the world to be. But having it be so, we took a concept that is really something that is in our communities, in our histories, which is helping each other out. Back when my parents were fleeing Vietnam, when a lot of the Southeast Asian folks had to go into the jungles to hide because the US had basically abandoned us in Southeast Asia, people organized around pots of rice, to make sure everyone got enough to eat. And it wasn't your family. It was often chosen family that then became fed by one pot of rice to make sure that everybody could eat. And those networks, even coming to the US, start to become chosen family. Those are the people that you go to when you need food because you're laid off or because you need someone to take care of your kids. So that notion was something that we wanted to uplift at this time. I was weirded out by the term mutual aid, to be honest, because it sounded something so different and so cold compared to what I know to be true for my own upbringing and my family. So we took the idea of backup rice, which is a concept that many refugees have felt like, if I have a 25 bag of rice, I'm going to be okay. I'm gonna have enough to make sure that my kids can eat. If I have a 50-pound bag of rice, even better. And being that we're Black and Southeast Asian, we didn't just do rice. We also did food staples for our Black families, because having a 50-pound bag of jasmine rice from Asian Corner is great for Southeast Asians, but it might not be what is culturally, we would, yeah, it's not the same for everyone. So for our Black families, we did that too, but we called it backup rice because we also know that the history of Black people in the US has been where people take in each other's kids, people help each other out. Like when you live in this system that isn't meant for your survival, that's what we know how to do. So our Operation Backup Rice was not just food, it was wellness checks. It was getting my grandma and other grandmas to make masks and distribute them throughout the drops. It was also getting Hmong farmers in Catawba who could no longer sell their produce. We bought it so that we could redistribute to everyone, so that there could be some green and not just like mama noodles, which we love, but it's not really healthy. And then it became a wellness check. So I think when mutual aid comes up, what you hear is the material needs of the community, but as organizers, we push ourselves to look further. So during the wellness checks is when we learned a lot about the domestic violence and sexual assault that was happening in the homes, because people have to be there. We heard stories from our youth who are of marginalized genders, how difficult and isolating it was to have to be at home and not be able to go see your friends or come to SEAC. We heard a lot about the mental health needs of our community, and there was just something that made us feel like having a 50-pound bag of rice could alleviate some stress, that the family's able to operate in a way that is less like when the pandemic hit. It was just as organizers, we just felt like it was coming from all directions. And I know for my dad, having that rice would have helped him feel less stressed about the bills and everything. So we couldn't do everything, but this is where we really focused. And we've done 10 or 11 rounds of backup rice, and we're continuing to. I would say the question about resources, though, is that it wasn't funded. The nonprofit industrial complex did not help. No foundation in North Carolina helped, I think partly because they didn't see us as a community that needed it. So we did the best we could with raising money for diapers, for food. I told some of my national funders that I don't know if you're going to be okay, but I'm using the money to provide for our Black, Southeast Asian, and trans siblings. But I'm going to be looking for more grant money for this. I'd say if there's anything that I want to have an ask for this call is that we really donate to a lot of my siblings in this fight that continue to fight at the front lines for what's going on right now, racial injustice in the US, which is tied to many different injustices. And these are my trans siblings that continue to not be held by any nonprofit. Because we can't actually move money in that way, but they continue to fight for all of us. So there's 2 Venmos that I'd like to put forward for people to donate to. The first is at Henry Free, HENRI Free, FREE, who's part of SEAC and the Sadish Collective. And then also Micah, who is a trans sibling here in Charlotte, who is going to redistribute a lot of the money they get. And Micah is Micah, MYKA-92 Tired Trans Femme. Again, that's Micah, MYKA-92 Tired Trans Femme. And I'll put that in for Alex too. So that's where I would love for people to donate.
And SEAC is doing incredible work. I think we also flashed the at SEAC Village handle. They are very active on social media. So if you'd like to help and connect, you can connect that way. Chavi, we have a few more minutes. You told us a little bit about the incredible work that your group is doing at NCAT. How can our community support you in the work that NCAT is doing?
Sure, yeah. Definitely a lot of respect for the work that SEAC and CAT are doing. I would say we're coming from it on a different sort of theory of change. And I really want to get everybody to fill out the census, to register to vote. if anyone wants to, it's ncat.vote. And we have an online registration portal. We have folks to help with that, and we're currently in the process of setting up a multilingual hotline, both to help with voter registration, census, and then also get out the vote efforts, voter education as we move further into the year. That's really where our focus is right now. Like Kat, we did wellness checks with folks, and I think where people are struggling the most is mental health in our communities. So really just checking out our website and coming to us for whatever resources we can provide around civic engagement.
Yeah, B, I just want to add also that like NCAT and SEAC are partners. We ride together. We are like the first Asian organizations in the state that are moving shit, which is really hard to do when you're constantly knocking on doors and having to interview for the legitimacy of your community. So I just want to give a shout out also to Chavi and to NCAT.
And I'll chime in here, just coming from the academic realm. I think there's so much more here too that can be done, and that can, that can support the work that SEAC and NCAT are doing as well. The first article just came out on COVID rates among Asian Americans, and I see that's already up from Levine Museum in the chat. And that article just aggregates the data. I was already trying to do this just through news articles, but it confirms that, first of all, the data collection is so poor and it's not disaggregated, so it's hiding a lot of inequities. We know that specific populations among Asian Americans are having extremely high rates of COVID. For example, immigrant groups that are involved in industries like meatpacking. So Pacific Islanders in California who are in this industry, Hmong and other Southeast Asians in the Midwest, and here in North Carolina as well, healthcare workers who are on the front lines. So there's so much more to be understood. And what this new data really highlighted also is that even though the case rates are not in all cases as high as those of African Americans or Latinx communities, which have been, I hope, well publicized, that people watching this may already be aware of, the fatality rate among Asian Americans is very high. And so that highlights a lot of silent healthcare inequities, healthcare access, the quality of healthcare once you're in the system. And so that's something, again, that I personally want to follow up and continue to try to highlight in my work. But I think it really speaks to the urgency of this moment for action and organizing and community support on all levels.
All three of you, while we've talked about the disparities, which can sometimes feel like a glass is half full conversation, all three of you have highlighted some incredible things that are happening out of these particularly difficult times. Let's just go ahead right into it. What is promising that we're seeing out there, and what can we do more of? Dr. Kim, would you like to start us off on that?
What is promising is, I think, the organizing that we're seeing, right? And the ability of groups to organize and gather and mobilize. NCAT didn't exist 10 years ago. SEAC didn't exist 10 years ago. We're seeing that change. And we're also starting to see, I think, better networks of allyship. And so that also, I hope, will take us to good places, right? UNC didn't have an Asian American Center a year ago, or 6 months ago, or 1 month ago for that matter. So we are really seeing that progress. And I think that we're in a moment where everyone is galvanized politically. And that gives me hope. It gives me responsibility too. I feel that all the time, but it gives me hope.
Chavi?
Yeah, like Heidi said, I think just a chat like this gives me hope. This wouldn't have happened before, and I appreciate it both because it's calling the attention of other people to the issues that impact the API community, and also just this wonderful chance to talk to my colleagues. I, I want to say what else has given me hope in particular is the bonding I've seen between different API ethnicities. We created something called a community partnership network, and it's different ethnic groups. They get together once a month, and they've really supported each other during this pandemic, and that's been just really wonderful to see. And the people who are interested in being politically engaged. If you want to volunteer, we need phone bakers and canvassers and all that, so check us out. I'm just really proud of our community, because as a model minority, we're often expected to not raise our voices. And I'm just really proud that we have been and will continue to. NCAT just formed an affiliated 501c4 organization and plans on really taking a more active role in the 2020 elections.
Yeah, I love that there's a Center for Asian American at Chapel Hill, or I don't know the name yet. I've been looking since I moved to North Carolina for something like that. And also, I think what gives me hope is, you know, during the darkest moments when attacks are coming from everywhere, I think I always try to remember that this creates a lot of openings for us to move together, but also deepen our analysis beyond just the impact of these systems, but to deepen our historical analysis of how this came to be, to deepen our, I think at this time it amplifies what's not working, what systems aren't working, you know? So I think that also is a big part of what we try to do, especially with our Southeast Asian communities, to do a lot of political education around this moment, because it is an opportunity. So that keeps me going for sure. I think also just knowing that this time is all about youth. Like Braxton, you were there in 2016 during the uprising, and 2020, this is our second uprising in Charlotte, and it's changed. The organizers have changed. It's we've gotten smarter, savvier, but also there's just this is summer school for our high schoolers out here. You know, they out here on the streets at jail support doing all of that. And that just gives me so much hope, and also helps me try to identify what my role is as formations change and as new folks come in. So yeah, that's one thing about movement. You never quite sit still, and it's constantly fluctuating.
Well, thank you all three. This question is going to be our last question, and it's specifically to Dr. Kim, but Chavi and Kat, if you want to chime in. We started this with history, and we want to end it with a little bit of history. What does history tell us that we should keep in mind as we move forward through this pandemic, and as we keep our siblings in the Asian American, greater Asian American community in our minds, in our thoughts, and in our actions? What does the history tell us that we should keep in mind?
Well, history tells us one really sobering lesson, which is that we don't learn from history, right? We forget it. We perpetuate the same mistakes. I'm really struck as I investigate some of this medical and public health history, specifically how we see the intersection of racism and public health crises repeat itself over and over again. And so that's a really important lesson, I think, in thinking about education, right? In thinking about the responsibility of self-education, as well as improving our public education and the diversity of our publishing industry, really basic things like that need to change in our society, along with all of the other systems, right, of incarceration and inequity that need to change. So, you know, history, it often points you in really specific directions. But that's been one lesson that I've been taking lately. And I think the other lesson that you get from history is that, you know, people often quote that idea that you know, the arc of history is bending towards justice, right? But that doesn't just happen on its own, and that's the other lesson that we take from history. That it takes change makers. It takes people like Kat and Chavi and those high schoolers who are out there on the streets, and that we can't just count on something, you know, happening, right? We can't count on things just naturally getting better and taking comfort from that. That's a really, really hollow promise. And it leads us to just being blind to all of the problems that we continue to have. So, but I don't want that to sound like a downer to end on, right? Because look at that hope sitting in Kat's lap. You know, history also just pushes us to make things better. And, you know, that's the inspiration I take from it. That's why I study it.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kim. Thank you, Chavi. Thank you, Kat, for blessing us with this conversation. I know our Levine community learned something, and this won't be the last conversation that we have. With that said, I would also thank our community that is watching on YouTube, on Facebook, on our homepage. Thank you for supporting our mission at Levine Museum of the New South of connecting the past to the future to realize the promises of a New South. This Shaping Charlotte event, we are honored to present it to you and can continue to host conversations like this around important issues of today, and we appreciate your support so we can continue to do so. Please see the link shown in the comment section or the final slide for tonight for ways that you can support Levine Museum of the New South while our doors are closed. My name is Braxton Winston. I am the Community Connections Manager at Levine Museum of the New South. Please stay safe, please take care of yourself, and please take care of one another. Thank you and good night.
Good night.
Night. Thank you.